This paper, this paper advances through our four integrated movements, each contributing to a rigorous intellectual and analytical engagement with the legacy of Mudimbe. The introduction titled Situating Mudimbe's Legacy, Reflections in the Work of an Intellectual Giant, anchors the study in the broader intellectual moment following Mudimbe's death. It frames the urgency of critical engagement with his work and situates this intervention within current scholarly discourses that both commemorate and critically revisit his contributions. The second part, under the heading contour of encounter, reflexivity, dialogue, and the affective geographies of intellectual engagement with Mudimbe, offers a self-reflexive account of the conditions, cultural, existential, and institutional, that shaped my dialogues with Mudimbe. This section serves as a methodological and epistemic prelude to the analytical work that follows. The third and central part, which is just that, I have titled as exegetical engagement, epistemic wounds and the unfinished project of liberation, trauma, decolonization, and decoloniality in the scholarly practice VY Mudimbe, present a close reading of select texts from Mudimbe's corpus, interrogating his treatment of trauma, colonial violence, and the ontological consequences of knowledge production within and beyond the colonial library. Finally, the conclusion, entitled Epistemologies of Vigilance and Identities in Contestation, synthesizes the implications of the preceding analysis. It highlights Mudimbe's enduring call for epistemological vigilance and affirms the notion of African identities as dynamic sites of resistance, transformation, and perpetual contestation in the face of coloniality's lingering monsters. As previously stated, two principal considerations underpin my readiness to engage with the intellectual legacy of Mudimbe. The first draws from a zoological and gastronomic metaphor subtly articulated by Professor Sali Kokomufwene during the Congo Academy Symposium held in Mudimbe's honor, an image to which many of us instinctively subscribed. In that metaphor, Mudimbe was likened to a large fish or a prized game animal, an epistemic quarry from which each of us might draw intellectual sustenance according to our appetites or methodological inclination. I wish to extend and transpose this metaphor into a botanical register, equally generative. Mudimbe is a great tree. This is not only in the sense evoked by Amadou Ampateba, who described the baobab as a repository of cultural, spiritual, and communal wisdom, but also in the likeness of the banyan tree, indigenous to South Asia and tropical East Africa. The banyan is expensive and archiving its aerial roots, forming multiple trunks, sheltering diverse life forms. In a similar fashion, Mudimbe's corpus offers a capacious intellectual canopy beneath which scholars from disparate disciplines, literature, philosophy, anthropology, theology, and history, found both refuge and inspiration. Another incisive remark by Professor Salikoko Mfwene affirms that Mudimbe is more African than many of us, a statement aimed at dismantling reductive critique that portray Mudimbe as estranged from African realities. The second, more intimate and grounding source of my engagement is personal. I describe it as my exilic triple-fold interpolation by Mudimbe. It encapsulates a deeply layered and transformative intellectual encounter. It reflects my position as a migrant African thinker, both geographically and epistemologically, engaging Mudimbe from a place of marginality and critical distance. This interpolation unfolds across three intersecting dimensions: philosophical, theological, and anthropological. In this framework, Mudimbe emerges not simply as a text to be read, but as a formative presence that calls me into a heightened critical consciousness and intellectual responsibility. I move to my second part, which is contour of encounter, reflectivity, dialogue, and the affective geographies of intellectual engagement with Mudimbe. To apprehend the contour of what I term my exilic triple-fold interpolation by Mudimbe, it is imperative, indeed a moral imperative, to resist the seductions of historical and contextual amnesia. To invoke Mudimbe's name without sweating my initial encounter with his thought within the vibrant yet fraught cultural and intellectual ferment of 1990s London would risk what I have elsewhere described as intellectual guilt, the disavowal of one's own epistemic and sociopolitical conditions of formation. My intellectual engagement with Mudimbe unfolded within a matrix of cultural effervescence, epistemological restlessness, and migratory precarity. While I had the privilege of studying at King's College and the Institute of Education, I simultaneously inhabited a condition of marginality, stigmatized by the conservative rhetoric of the Tory government as a so-called bogus economic refugee, even as I ministered pastorally among African migrant communities in Northwest London. This paradox of belonging, simultaneously included and excluded, shaped not only my intellectual disposition, but also my hermeneutical orientation toward figures like Mudimbe, whose own work is deeply marked by questions of displacement, exile, and epistemic rupture. The London of the 1990s presented a unique convergence of scholarly vitality and post-colonial contestation. Less than a mile from King's College, London, my alma mater, Anthony Giddens drew substantial audiences with his lectures on interpretations of modernity. At the School of Oriental and African Studies, a constellation of towering intellectuals animated critical conversation. Ali Mazuri dissected the ideological underpinnings of Lord Lugard's doctrine of indirect rule. Roland Shoinka delivered searing critique of post-colonial melancholia. Samir Amin theorized the planetary scope of neoliberalism, and Mary Douglas, returning to her Lele ethnography from the Kasai, Mudimbe's ancestral region, reassessed the limitations of structuralist anthropology. Yet, this intellectual topography was not insulated from the geopolitical fractures that haunted African students. Within the compact intellectual geography of Bloomsbury, house to King's College, London School of Economics, SOAS, UCL, Birkbeck College, and Institute of Education, diasporic tensions mirrored continental cleavages. Friendships fractured overnight as Hutu and Tutsi, Eritreans and Ethiopians brought Africa's unresolved historical trauma into close proximity. It was also during this period that Mobutu's regime disintegrated. I recall vividly that on the day of Mobutu's death, Julius Nyerere was lecturing on Shakespeare at SOAS. Following his talk, I approached him to comment on a Western media claimed that Mobutu had left behind only millions, not billions. Nyerere, with sharp irony, replied, and I quote, "Where is it? I want to see it," end of quote. SOAS, of course, was not merely an academic institution. It was a crucible of post-colonial critique and African intellectual inquiry. Its library served as a sanctuary for those engaged with Africa's political, philosophical, and epistemological futures. I recall encountering students of diverse intellectual and ideological lineages, some descendants of the Leakey family, others of Zimbabwean settler farmer stock, whose often contending perspectives nonetheless enriched the polyphonic debates that marked that space. At the University College London, UCL, Murray Last convened rigorous dialogues between thinkers such as Pierre Bourdieu and René de Visch, juxtaposing the former concepts of habitus and social capital with Yaka cosmologies and ethno-psychiatric frameworks. Meanwhile, at the Institute of Education, Mary Douglas delivered her now iconic lecture, Beyond the Body, a Foucaultian interpretation of African traditional healing systems, pointedly refusing to share the platform with Basil Burston, whom she accused of publicly undermining her work for nearly 3 decades. At the same institution, Professor Stuart Hall, Jamaican-born British sociologist and founding figure of the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, offered one of his final interventions in post-colonial and diasporic thought, emphasizing Britain's formation as a diasporic and a hybrid society forged through imperial history and reconstituted by post-colonial migration. The School of Oriental African Studies exerted an unparalleled intellectual magnetism of African students, negotiating the complex scholarly milieu of 1990s London. It was within this epistemic and institutional context, most notably through Louis Brenner's seminal course, African Thought, that I first encountered the oeuvre of Mudimbe in a rigorous and sustained academic framework. Brenner's curriculum provided a critical platform for engaging African epistemologies beyond reductive essentialisms. Mudimbe's writings were approached with a complex affective and cognitive register, a synthesis of reverence, hermeneutic caution, and epistemological vertigo. His stature as an unyielding and incisive intellectual of Africanist discourse was firmly established, a characterization powerfully reaffirmed in Ali Mazuri's public lecture at SOAS, where Mudimbe was lauded as a scholar who decisively unsettled established African intellectual genealogies. And during one of Mudimbe's visits to SOAS, at the event convened by the Royal African Society, I was afforded the singular honor of meeting him, both as a fellow Congolese and a young student. Subsequently, I extended an invitation for him to lecture on African philosophy at the Institution of Education. This lecture, which convened over 200 participants from a wide disciplinary and geographic spectrum, constituted a veritable tour de force, a meticulous deconstruction of the epistemic infrastructure underpinning colonial discourse, coupled with an urgent imperative for the revitalization of African philosophical practices in the contemporary moment. For me, this occasion transcended the parameters of academic formality. It was a transformative, even providential event that precipitated a profound reorientation of my intellectual trajectory. That same evening, as we proceeded to the Africa Center for a modest repast, accompanied by 3 friends, 2 South African colleagues, and an Eritrean, I underwent what I have since theorized as my exilic triple-fold interpolation by Mudimbe, an intersubjective moment of critical awakening, which unfolded across theological, anthropological, and philosophical registers. Our dialogue fluidly, oscillating between French and English, extended over 2 hours and was succeeded a week later by Mudimbe's gracious dispatch of Volume 10, the special issue of Society of African Philosophy of North America from the United States. Retrospectively, this encounter constituted a decisive kairos within my intellectual development, employing the psychoanalytic lexicon of Jacques Lacan. I experienced an epistemic basculement, a rupture of near existential gravity commensurate in its intensity with the Pollard Convention on the road to Damascus. The catalyst for this transformative encounter was my disclosure to Mudimbe that I had recently completed a philosophy master's thesis in theology at King's College entitled The Relationality of Human Life, a comparative study of Luther's theological anthropology and John Samuel Mbiti's account of the traditional African interpretation of humanity, and that I was embarking upon a doctoral project focused on concepts of health and therapeutic options among Congolese refugees in London, a project in which the late legendary British anthropologist Mary Douglas had served as a secondary advisor and mentor. What was anticipated as a convivial evening meal rapidly transmuted into an extended 3-hour dialectical seminar, as Mudimbe, true to his intellectual rigor, transformed the occasion into a site of epistemological rupture and reconstruction. Unanticipated was the extent to which both John Samuel Mbiti and Mary Douglas, pillars of my theological and anthropological formation, occupied contested and ambivalent position within Mudimbe's critical cartography. While Mudimbe acknowledged John Mbiti as among the foremost African theologians of the 20th century, he nonetheless subjected his corpus to penetrating critique, diagnosing within it a bifurcated epistemological orientation, simultaneously political and religious, that risked reinscribing colonial epistemes under the guise of reclaiming African authenticity. Mbiti's theorization of African temporality or concept of time as moving backward into the Zamani, to use the Swahili word, and projecting the future within an eschatological Christocentric, not yet, was for Mudimbe perilously proximate to reaffirming the teleological architecture of the colonial library. It exemplified a pernicious tendency to legitimate African religious discourses by unwittingly reproducing the ontological frameworks of colonial domination. Concerning Mary Douglas, my mentor friend and author of seminal texts such as Puritan Danger and the Natural Symbols, Mudimbe's critique was unequivocal. Although he acknowledged the empirical rigor of her ethnographic work among the Lele of Kasai, Mudimbe's ancestral homeland, he ultimately repudiated her structural functionalism as ideologically complicit with the colonial project. Her analytical categories in his assessment lacked sufficient reflexivity and reinforced the epistemic logic of containment intrinsic to colonial anthropology. As our evening conversation ended, Mudimbe turned to me with characteristic gravitas and exhorted me. Adrien, as a young African scholar, I invite you to immerse yourself thoughtfully in my corpus. I want you to engage critically with my work. But again, as a Protestant Baptist pastor, Adrien, please delve deeply into the philosophical writings of Paul Ricoeur. This exhortation was not a mere bibliographic recommendation. It was an existential and epistemic summons. It called for the cultivation of what Mudimbe terms as epistemological vigilance, a hermeneutic of suspicion, sharpened in my case by pastoral practices among African immigrant communities in London, disciplined by rigorous philosophical inquiry and attuned to the subterranean dynamics shaping knowledge production. In retrospect, this encounter did not merely inform my intellectual sensibilities, it constituted them. Mudimbe, simultaneously mentor, intellectual, and provocateur, compelled me to expunge my residual intellectual naivete and to undertake the arduous yet indispensable labor of the colonial critique, an unavoidable task for each African scholar. Having delineated this conceptual contour, I now proceed to articulate the sub-themes, problematics, and guiding questions embedded within the overarching theme of my presentation. My approach unfolds through a series of analytically condensed synopses of 4 of Mudimbe's books intended to eliminate the epistemic lacerations, wounds inscribed upon the African subject that emerge as symptoms of historically embedded trauma. These trauma are not merely individual or existential, they are epistemological and civilizational, encoded in the textures of African literature, philosophical, and intellectual discourses. Part 3 is a critical engagement, epistemic wounds, and the ever unfinished project of liberation, trauma, decolonization, and decoloniality in the scholarly practice of Valentin-Yves Mudimbe. Mudimbe's most famous book, The Invention of Africa, is a profound diagnostic meditation on the epistemological and ontological condition of the African subject as shaped by the colonial encounter. It presents a tripartite structure through which Mudimbe undertakes a philosophical and genealogical investigation into the discursive and institutional formations that have historically constructed Africa as an object of knowledge, and concomitantly the African as an alienate subject. First, Mudimbe offers a rigorous philosophical and methodological framework that underscores his central diagnosis approach that every discourse on the other, in this case Africa, is inescapably structured by the socio-historical and cultural episteme in which it is embedded. Drawing on Foucauldian archaeology and Derridian deconstruction, Mudimbe posits that any knowledge produced about Africa is never neutral, but always inscribed within the contour of power, ideology, and the epistemological violence of Western hegemony. The Invention of Africa is thus an epistemological project, an ordering of knowledge that seeks not to understand Africa as it is, but to define, delimit, and discipline it with the logics of Eurocentric modernity. Second, Mudimbe identifies colonization as the fundamental causal factor in the disfiguration of the African condition. Colonization for Mudimbe is not only a political and economic system, but also an epistemological rupture, an intrusive event that restructured African modes of being, knowing, and symbolizing. It produces a crisis of gnosis and interruption of indigenous epistemologies and a replacement of African self-understanding with a set of imposed representations rooted in Western metaphysics and enlightenment rationalism. The colonial process, therefore, did not simply dominate African territories, it re-engineered African subjectivities. This is what Mudimbe articulates in an almost elegiac tone, and I quote, "The scramble for Africa and the most active period of colonization lasted less than a century. This event, which involved the greater part of the African continent, occurred between the late 19th and the mid-20th centuries. Although these in African history, the colonial experience represent but a brief moment from the perspective of today, this moment is still charged of controversial, since, to say the least, it signified a new historical form of the possibility of radically new types of discourses on African traditions and cultures. One might think that this new historical form has meant from its origins the negations of two contradictory myths, namely the Obasian picture of pre-European Africa, in which there was no account of time, no art, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continued fear and danger of violent death, and the Rousseauian picture of African golden age of perfect liberty, equality, and fraternity, end of quote. This narrative constitutes, in essence, a diagnosis, pronouncement on a foundational pathological event, a neurogenary rupture whose causal implications continue to reverberate across the epistemic and socio-historical landscape. Third, Mudimbe examines the pathological effects of this historical trauma or pathological event on the African being. He analyzes a spectrum of African intellectual responses, from assimilation to resistance, from mimicry to epistemological vigilance, as symptomatic expressions of a deeper psychological and epistemic disequilibrium. Figures such as the Nigerian preacher Samuel Ajayi Crawford, we're talking about just the 19th century, and Edward Wilmot Blyden, the great Liberian or Sierra Leonean just preacher, embody early forms of hybrid identity negotiation caught between Africanity and Christianity, between tradition and Western modernity. The Negritude movement, particularly for Leopold Sédar Senghor, articulates a poetic of return and a racial essence, while Fanon's psychoanalytic radicalism exposes the colonial wound as a structure of alienation inscribed on the Black body and psyche. These diverse intellectual strategies, though distinct, are all symptomatic of shared condition, the colonial reconstruction of the African self through the violence of representation. In this book, Mudimbe introduces the notion of epistemological vigilance as a critical imperative for post-colonial African thought. This concept refers to the need for a constant interrogation of the very frameworks for which Africa has been conceived and conceptualized, an effort to unearth the buried structures of colonial power that persist in post-colonial discourses and institutions. Central to Mudimbe's argument in this book is the identification of three primary vectors: colonial administrator, missionary, and anthropologists, who functioned as instrumental agents in the epistemological construction of Africa. These actors operating within and for the Western episteme collaborated intentionally or otherwise in the orchestration of a totalizing knowledge regime aimed at legitimatizing the colonial enterprise. The colonial administrator mapped and managed space, the missionary reconfigured belief and salvation, and the anthropologist codified difference and otherness. Each, in their own way, contributed to hegemonic inscription of Africa as a space of deficiency and authority. In Foucauldian terms, the colonial project was a power knowledge apparatus that subjected Africa to the panoptic gaze of the West Africa, of the West. Africa was constituted as a docile body and corps docile, a surveyed and disciplined space devoid of autonomous historicity, agency, or rationality. It was, to borrow Hegel's infamous phrasing, a side of history, a negated temporality requiring Western intervention to be rendered meaningful. Hence, the nation of Africa as an intelligible object is itself a colonial artifact. Africa, as Mudimbe insists, had to be invented. The second book just said that unlike Mudimbe's the invention of Africa and the idea of Africa, which exhibits a predominantly rhetorical structure aligned with, I would say, the Aristotelian tradition of dialectical persuasion and conceptual contestation, parables and fables, emerges as a text that is at once rhetorical, autobiographical, and apologetic. Yes, and apologetic. While it retells the dense intellectuality and philosophical rigor characteristic of Mudimbe's oeuvre, it departs from a purely theoretical mode and turns, in part, towards a more embodied and personal epistemic reflection rooted in the specificity of the author's own cultural provenance and intellectual itinerary. Mudimbe anchors his intellectual odyssey within the historically charged context of the seminal French academic year of 1968 and 1969, a moment emblematic of epistemic rupture and socio-political reconfiguration. He writes, and I quote, "With other young teachers, I joined the faculty of the University of Paris-Nanterre to the Department of Ethnology and Comparative Sociology. Everyone knew that I was completing a doctoral dissertation in comparative philology and finishing a complementary thesis on the political philosopher Berkov. The university, in fact, seemed to need young scholars who could, on the one hand, speak and understand students' language, and in so doing, to provide an alternative discourse to what was being questioned by the 1968 students uprising. On the other hand, we were supposed to believe in the mission of the university as established by the French tradition and as stipulated by French government. I personally accepted the challenge of meeting these contradictory demands and began to share my weeks between Louvain, Belgium, and Paris-Nanterre. At Louvain, I was quietly reading ancient Greek, Latin, and French texts, and from time to time, I would direct Professor Willy Ball's seminars and correct undergraduate theses in Indo-European philology. I enjoyed, in brief, an atemporal peace. At Nanterre, however, I had to be a believer in the vocation and grandeur of the French university system. And at the same time, I had to be capable of entering into dialogue with even the most extreme leftist theories. I did not hide the fact that I was then a practicing Catholic, although philosophically agnostic. The intellectual atmosphere of Paris was explosive. Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir were on the street helping the cause of the Maoists. Claude Lévi-Strauss was a god dominating most of us in the department, appropriately called the Laboratoire d'Ethnologie et de Sociologie Comparative. When in 1973, Lévi-Strauss was elected to the Académie Française, some of my colleagues and students went into mourning. They were convinced that such an election to one of the most elitist institutions could only be a sign of betrayal toward what Lévi-Strauss had been teaching about idleness. Louis Althusser articles were published for the first time as a book. This, entitled For Marx, was regarded as a sort of the leftist Bible, which unveiled new possibilities in Marxian and Marxist interpretations. In order to face my students at Nanterre, I was in the first year participating at Louvain in a rigorous interdisciplinary seminar, reading Capital, that scrupulously followed the syllabus conceived by Althusser. Jacques Lacan was still, despite the problem with the French university and the order of physicians and psychologists, initiating his students into a rethinking of Freud, focusing on the little object A as that which silently manipulates us and as that which represses. He demonstrated that it nonetheless marks us and our choices. Such an intellectual contest could not but force me to articulate a number of questions about myself. Here I was, so to speak, the margin of margins, Black, Catholic, African, yet agnostic, intellectually Marxist, disposed to psychoanalysis, yet a specialist in Indo-European philology and philosophy. How could all this relate to myself, my origins, and my transcendence as a human being? I presented at Louvain my dissertation on the concept of air, A-I-R, and my complementary thesis on Berkov's language in 1970, end of quote. In this regard, parables and fables may be read as a careful, curated apologetic gesture, apologetic not in the sense of mere self-defense, but as a systematic and deeply reasoned justification of both Mudimbe's authority to speak and write anthropologically, and of his academic trajectory as a subject who is simultaneously from Africa and capable of theorizing about Africa. He constructs with deliberate care what might be termed an intellectual counter-mythology, a mode of epistemic legitimization that does not rely on the conventional Western structures of anthropological authorization, but instead subverts them by foregrounding his own journey, what Mudimbe calls his Odyssey, as both scholar and subject. The book also functions as an ethnographic inquiry through which the author critically engages and documents his Luba Songe heritage, an epistemic anchoring that simultaneously disrupts and reclaims inherited modes of representations from within. He writes, and I quote, "One may ask, whence came my authority? And what does it mean to use it apropos of Luba or Songe peoples and tradition?" My answer will be simple. It is true that I am not an anthropologist and do not claim to be one. I spent at least 10 years of my life studying ancient Greek and Latin for an average of 12 hours each week, with more than that amount of time devoted to French and European cultures before being eligible for a doctorate in comparative philology, Greek, Latin, and French at Louvain University. I do not know how many anthropologists who could publicly demonstrate a similar experience about their specialty in order to found their authority in African studies. This indeed, despite its emotional efficiency, the worst argument I could have invoked. I had to go through these years of education, as did my European co-disciples who chose to specialize in philology and philosophy, end of quote. This dual purpose to retract his intellectual path and to contest hegemonic structures of anthropological authorship is what constitutes the book's dominant leitmotifs. Indeed, parables and fables functions as a direct challenge to the epistemological arrogance embedded in some just Eurocentric discourses. just prerogative to name and interpret Africa, particularly through disciplines such as anthropology. Mudimbe subtly but insistently reclaims the right not only to speak about Africa, but to theorize from within its own pluriversal epistemologies. In so doing, he disrupts the classical anthropological gaze, calling into question the legitimacy of those who position Africa exclusively as an object of knowledge rather than a site of intellectual production. In this context, Mudimbe's invocation of his Luba song heritage is far from a nostalgic return to origins. Rather, it functions as a set of epistemic resistance and reflexivity, allowing him to destabilize the boundary between the primitive and the civilized, the local and the universal, that continues to haunt some Western discourses about Africa. Through the literary and philosophical apparatus of parables and fables, genres that themselves defy strict categorization and exist in the interstitial space between fictions and truth. Mudimbe enacts a rhetorical strategy that is simultaneously poetic, disruptive, and scholarly. Beyond the core epistemic interventions, Parables and Fables offers a subtle yet rich engagement with the nature of African intellectual production itself. Mudimbe maps the trajectories of African scholarly discourses as inescapably entangled with and at times in reaction to the Western episteme. However, he refuses to reduce African thought to mere response or mimicry. Instead, Mudimbe demonstrates how African scholars navigate, appropriate, subvert, or exceed the constraint of Western knowledge paradigms. In so doing, Mudimbe advances what may be described as a theory of African discursive autonomy, a call from Africa, an Africa that not only is interpreted but interprets, not only is constructed but constructs. These thematic gestures can be read as epistemic wounds, scars left by centuries of colonial epistemic violence, but also openings through which new forms of knowledge may emerge. Mudimbe writes not to suture these wounds with faster healing, but to expose them as the very site of intellectual production. In his own words, and I quote, "Yet what my text indicates and designates is our common and subjective freedom. We can read and comment about the passions present in transcribed and oral traditions, written texts, and performances in African or European languages, and indeed reconstruct and or deconstruct the history, argument, and paradigms of the anthropological and colonial libraries," end of quotes. The third book, which is Mudimbe's Just Between Tides, stands as a recap. Just let me move my slide. Between Tides stands as a remarkable and painful testimonial of the psychic, cultural, and philosophical ruptures induced by colonial and post-colonial encounters. At the heart of the narrative is Pierre Landu, a Congolese seminarian and the protagonist of this existential and epistemological odyssey. His story, while specific, is unmistakably emblematic, a cipher for Mudimbe himself and for a broader generation of African thinkers caught in the tempest of conflicting words. Formed within the ascetic and disciplinarian regime of a Catholic monastery, Landu undergoes a radical epistemic dislocation, estranged from the symbolic and affective matrices of his Luba song heritage, yet persistently unsettled by and interrogative of the normative claims of imposed epistemologic order. His reception of a new name, Brother Matthew of St. Mary, is not merely a liturgical formality, it is a symbolic erasure of indigenous identity and forced grafting onto a Euro-Christian epistemic order. It is crucial at this juncture to acknowledge the axiomatic construct both imposed by the colonizers and internalized by the colonized that operate as an unquestioned epistemological premise within the colonial order of knowledge. Mudimbe articulates this concept through the following formulations, and I quote, "In colonial times, a priest, even a black priest, was somebody different. Intellectually, he moved in circles that allied with the masters. He was accepted. He knew that by his priesthood, he had broken through a barrier. His life, offered to the divine embrace, was lived in a glow of human happiness. He was no longer classed with the damned. He enjoyed a signal honor. He could intercede with God for any man, even a colonist. To be expelled from the seminary was a profound disgrace, the most heinous," end of quote. Scholars like Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. have pointed to the text as an exemplar of the broader crisis of intellectual modernity, the crisis experienced by those whose formation is shaped by cross-cultural encounters that disrupt inherited cosmologies without fully resolving them into coherent alternatives. In this sense, the text dramatizes what Frantz Fanon, Michel Foucault, Paul Ricoeur, and others refer to as the wound of memory, the painful residue of having once believed in metaphysical certainties now irreparably fractured. Indeed, Mudimbe's Pianlando embodies what might be called a pathological modernity, a form of modern consciousness marked not by emancipation, but by spiritual dissonance. He is not simply torn between Africa and Europe, but between being and knowing, between belief and doubt, between ancestral presence and colonial absence. His trajectory affirms the epistemological disjunction of the African subject under colonial and post-colonial regime, to know as the other desires, but to be incapable of reconciling this knowledge with the self-ancestral grounding. This is precisely the implication of Mudimbe's assertion when he writes, and I quote, "Pietro Caro, isn't it painful to be Christian and African both? No, my friend, my parents never understood me, but I don't feel like a split personality. How can that be?" I wondered at his persistence. Why should he insist that I be a man divided? End of quote. To read between threads is to witness a form of trauma that is less historical than ontological. It is not only that things have fallen apart, but that the very center of being no longer holds, to invoke Chinua Achebe's haunting refrain. In fact, Achebe's "things fall apart and no longer at ease" serve as powerful intertexts for between threads. For like Achebe's Obi Okonko, Pianlando is caught in the undertow colonial modernity's broken promises. He is no longer at ease, not with his ancestors, not with spiritual mentors, not even with himself. And as in Achebe's novels, the tragedy is that this loss of ease is not a temporary malaise, but a permanent mark, a scar carried as the course of historical transition without ontological repair. In conclusion, Between Threads stand as one of the most poignant intellectual testimonies of Africa's epistemic dismemberment in the modern age. Mudimbe was not merely to narrate trauma, but to philosophize for it, to lay bare the cause of becoming a subject who thinks across worlds, but belongs wholly to none. This linguistic and epistemic trauma is acutely embodied by African intellectuals such as Léopold Senghor, whose essay Pourquoi écrire en français, why do I write in French, stands as a poignant response to critique of his use of the colonizer's language. In it, Senghor both resists and reclaims the French language, revealing the deep ambivalence at the heart of post-colonial authorship. Now, my last book, which is Before the Birth of the Moon, just is a transient and anti-nationalist narrative that deconstructs the vacuity of nationalist discourse when severed from ethical grounding and historical interrogation. Mudimbe text locates itself squarely within the post-independence moment, yet what it reveals is not the triumphant emergence of a sovereign African political order, but rather the insidious persistence through internalized modalities of the colonial project now managed by indigenous African elites. The narrative constructs a tableau in which the ethical collapse of political leadership is rendered through motives of erotic excess, religious hypocrisy, material corruption, and systemic violence. The figure of the Minister of State epitomizes this degeneration. His political power is sustained through sexual exploitation, orgastic rituals, and brutal suppression. In counterpoint, the novel presents the insurgent agency of the marginalized, those relegated to the peripheries of social power who resist domination through subversive strategies, including the politicization of sexuality. Such is the case of Ya, a young woman from the Mudimbe region whose family's extreme precarity forces her into the metropolis, where she becomes the minister's mistress. The novel sustained attention to scenes of sexual transgression, political obscenity, and corporal commodification lends itself to a reading within the genre of political erotica, albeit one marked by epistemological rapture rather than voyeuristic pleasure. Ya's narrative arc reaches a moment of tragic climax upon receiving devastating news about her father's death, and I quote, "They have killed him. Some young people found his head near the Meli Spring. His body disappeared. We never knew what they did to him. He died because he knew that things were not as they should be. There are the rich and the poor. The rich stand guard so that this difference will continue, so that there will always be the poor to be their slaves. In earlier days, in our village, things were not like that. That's why we thought the whites, they left, and now it is our own people of our own race who," end of quote. The elegiac reflections crystallizes the central political irony of the novel. Decolonization has not dismantled the structures of domination, but has instead relocated them. The mechanisms of control now embodied by African elites continue to replicate the logic of colonial hierarchy under a different guise. In this regard, Mudimbe's critique of neocolonial governance parallels the scathing condemnations of King Leopold II, offered by Joseph Conrad in Heart of Darkness and Adam Hochschild in King Leopold's Ghost. Just as Leopold shrouded his imperial brutality in the benevolent language of civilizational uplift, so too do post-colonial African leaders in Mudimbe's world conceal authoritarianism and greed beneath the hollow rhetoric of national development and cultural renaissance. The narrative's emotional and political intensities are amplified through their intertextual resonance with African protest music, most notably the Congolese Franklin Bukaka's Aïe Africa aux libertés. Aïe Africa aux libertés, a revolutionary anthem immortalized by the Cameroonian Manu Dibango's powerful saxophone interpretation. This song, a dual lament and indictment of post-independence disillusionment, reverberates throughout the subtextual strata Mudimbe's novel. Bukaka hunting refrain, "Oh Africa, where is your liberty?" could well serve as the epigraph of Before the Birth of Mudimbe. Mudimbe mobilizes this sonic archive not as a mere nostalgia, but as a subversive literary strategy. His prose become a form of intellectual jazz, improvisational, polyphonic, dissonant, or the aesthetics of the novel derive their force not from narrative resolution, but from rapture, like Manu Dibango's saxophone. Mudimbe's language welds, fractures, and resonates through layers of trauma, irony, and epistemic vertigo. The musicality of the novel lies precisely in its refusal to produce false harmonies, in its insistence on discord as the truthful the registers of postcolonial experience. As the song goes, Aye Africa, oh lipanda. Kokata koni pasi, soki na kati koteka pasi, basoso oyo toponaka, bawela bokonzi pe na bavoiture. Aye Africa, oh liberté. Nakomi tunaka, mondele akenda, lipanda tozwa, kasianani o bandeko. Translated into English, the song reads, "Cutting wood is hard. Selling it is no easier. With such suffering, my children and I cannot survive. Those we elected were eager to claim power, but when election time comes, suddenly I become important to them. And I ask myself, the white man is long gone. So for whom did we gain independence? What is the meaning of independence? Aye Africa, Africa of freedom." To conclude my paper, Mudimbe's oeuvre confronts us with the unresolved violence of colonial epistemologies and the ethical imperative to dislodge their lingering presence in African thought. His work demands of African intellectuals an unrelenting epistemological vigilance and alertness to the inherited frameworks that shape not only what we know, but how we come to know. Far from offering final answers, Mudimbe calls for a scholarly practice rooted in critical reflexivity, conceptual rupture, and a refusal of closure. His intellectual legacy is thus a summons to forge African identities, not as fixed essences, but as dynamic, contested sets of memory, resistance, and theoretical renewal. Thank you very much, my friends. I'm done.
Thank you very much for this extensive talk on the life of Mudimbe. Professor Makoni, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adrien. I want to get into a conversation with you, starting from a very mundane question, and then we can build up the argument.
Thank you.
Right. If you were to bump into Mudimbe now, and you were to ask him, of all the various books that he has written, which one does he like least? Which one doesn't he like at all?
Professor Makoni, that's a big question now. Just there was a joke in one of the forums, Congo Academy.
Yeah.
His ex-wife, Elizabeth Cam. In fact, as I said, I've got just a great relationship with her. And as you know, she's a great scholar herself, emeritus
Yes.
professor Elizabeth Mudimbe, who taught us just Stanford University.
Mhm.
Which book Mudimbe lacks, and it is very hard to say. But
Okay.
Mudimbe came to America through just a good friend of ours, Professor Wat McAfee, who is to me as a father. What McAfee did his ethnographies in Bakongo, where I come from, and just what McAfee just speaks Kikongo. He's American, and who came to Congo in 1963, and he's one with leading just cultural anthropologists in the Congo just studies and widely read just around the world. He met Mudimbe just in the Congo, and just he managed to bring Mudimbe here. And
Okay.
just he brought Mudimbe at Haverford College. Now, you know, Haverford College is a small college in
Yes, yes,
Philadelphia.
yes.
And that's where just Mudimbe began his American just academic journey. Mudimbe was already known in the French world in the Congo. But when he came here, he was not that well known, and he made a promise to a friend, Professor Wat McAfee did his best to get him at Harvard College to teach, where he taught for some years. And in the words of of Wat McAfee, just Harvard College became too small for Mudimbe. And it was like bringing just the American presidential airplane to a small just airport and so
Yeah.
on. Just and so on, that to use that metaphor used, and Mudimbe made a promise to what McAfee said that Wyatt, within 10 years, I've
Yes.
been known and studied in America. That's a promise he made to just to Wat McAfee. But it happened that in the words of Wat McAfee, just within 5 years, just Mudimbe was already well known in America, and so on. And it is very hard to say which book, because whether we want it or not,
Yes.
all of Mudimbe's books are just to some extent self-expression of his own being.
Okay.
And yes, that's what I'll say.
Okay. Now my next question links to this. As he moved towards the end of his life, what was he working on? Was he
What was he working on? Quite hard to say. I think you and I spoke about him at some point. I'm one of those people who benefited from Mudimbe, to be honest with you, from our first encounter in London. And when I came to this country, just serving as a Baptist chaplain at American University,
Yeah.
I want him to come to speak at American University from Duke. But again, the politics of university, as you know, we couldn't afford what we had afford. Mudimbe had many projects, and there is one of the projects he once told me that he was working on, that to make a critique of Sheikh Anta Diop's work.
Okay.
But we told him, please don't do that. That's a very big and we begged him to not engage in that word, and that is it. But Mudimbe, at the end of his life, just had health issues. There were even rumors, just as I once told you, people suspected that Mobutu Mudimbe resumed his first life as a monk, but which wasn't the case, because he died in just North Carolina. And what was he working on? I don't know. We know that his just library of thousand books, just he shipped it to Congo, to Lubumbashi. But again, I know that in his last days, he was unable really to do that much.
Okay. Okay. Now, there are some young scholars here who may not know about him. I want you to give me a sense of, you have given us a very good exposition of him as a scholar. What was he like as a person?
Thank you. And again, that's a good question. Just, Makoni, you've got to come to Congo Academy. And,
yes, I will come.
Just please do. We need you, brother. You are a big brother, you know, just young people who need you. And just, I would use my biblical metaphor. Just, you know, when just when you read the Bible, there is the statement where just Jacob met the angel and he wrestled with him all night. And he said that I will not let you go until you have blessed me. And that's blessed me that I want to wrestle with Professor Just Makoni is a big brother to bless us. Yes. As a human just I think Professor Salikoko told us many stories about Mudimbe, whom he knew from Lubumbashi, and as a human being, he was very, very simple guy, joking, and just in fact at Duke University, just he just, although he became that agnostic, but he used even to, how to say, to recite the Catholic Church, to read in Latin for them. You see, and Mudimbe will just read for them just in Latin. And again, Professor Salikoko told us that once he visited Mudimbe, just Mudimbe took him just for just dinner, and just Mudimbe said that, okay, Sali, I do not drink anymore. Why don't you drink anymore? Because one day he came from the university, just he took one, and then he was driving, the police just arrested him. And when arrested him, they found that in his car he was playing some classic music.
Yes.
Then
yes.
It was a very humorous moment, to the extent that he became good friends of the police, and in fact he became a member of the police, or just the, how do you call it again, the police order in North Carolina, that from time to time he would intervene. He was a very approachable person, and very, very approachable, and that's what I'll say. Very simple.
Okay.
Yes.
He was an honorary sheriff.
You see, honorary sheriff.
Yes. After the encounter with he was playing Gregorian songs in his car. Yeah. And he became an honorary sheriff of the locality.
Here we go.
And when you look at his career now, if you were to meet some of the young colleagues here, what advice would you give them?
My advice would be that, please be inquisitive.
Okay.
Just Africa is a big just epistemological arena, and you have to cultivate this eclectic, just scholarly way of getting discourse on Africa, and the Mudimbe is one person who can help you to have that kind of analytical just gaze. That's my advice. We have heard that Mudimbe is not easy to read. The people used to just to joke that if you want to understand Mudimbe, you have first to read Foucault, Michel Foucault. But Foucault himself is very hard. How do you want me to read first Mudimbe? It is very, very hard. And
So from your perspective, the issue is that it's not so much that he is hard to read. It's a question of how much commitment you want to invest in understanding one of the greatest minds that Africa has produced so far. And you have to invest the time. I mean, the guy invested the time in writing this, and if you want to make sense of it, you also have to invest the time. But I think the point you are making is that what he exhibited was breadth of scholarship. When you were talking about him, from discussions about philosophy, the novels that he wrote, poetry, fiction, all these things, it's a breadth of scholarship, a broad range of scholarship. And that, I think, is the defining aspect of what of Mudimbe. And then the point you made, which I thought was useful and which is worth restating, was that the African scholarship that Mudimbe was trying to articulate was not simply reacting to what other people were doing, but to shape the discourses about other scholars. That I thought was a good point to make. That is a good point to make. Let me give over to Amazing, because I think there are a number of people.
And again, Professor Demakoni, just my brother, if there is a book that I will recommend,
Yes,
African to engage with,
yes,
that's the Parables and Fables.
yes.
And why that book? Because that book
Yes.
it is really a synopsis of the African inquisitive mind.
Yes, yes.
Well, because in African mind, where the student is exposed to different forms of scholarship.
Yes.
It's only that one is informed by his, and again to use Pierre Bourdieu's word, habitus, just his own territory, his own worldview, and again what he has read just from his own culture, but again that engagement with the Western world. And again the African mind is a rich mind, so to say. It's very informed. And Mudimbe is the epitome of the macrocosm of really what the African inquisitiveness is.
Yes, good. Yeah, thanks a lot. Amazing.
Vanessa has a question. She asked, how can we overcome our individual subjectivities to unite as a stronger group?
Hey, how do we transcend African and again, thank you, because what you a friend is asking is a good question. Professor Makoni will tell you that some years ago, 2 years ago, we had a great scholar here, your friend from Columbia University, the Senegalese fellow, what's his name?
Yes,
yes. And as you know that he works a lot on this concept of Ubuntu.
Yes.
And which is a very wonderful concept. And again, personally, I became very much acquainted with that discourse when I was doing my philosophy master's in theology at King's College, because I worked with the work of John Samuel Mbiti, whose concept of being I was comparing to the German reformer Martin Luther concept of being human. Now, Mbiti has that very wonderful anthropological dictum, according to which for African to be is to belong. I am because you are. Since you are, therefore I am.
Yes.
And that's a very wonderful philosophical dictum which really encapsulates the African concept of being. And again, our fellows from South Africa, the Zulu and Xhosa, they have this wonderful expression, umuntu ke muntu kabantu. And which really translates that idea, what it means to be in Africa. That the African concept of being human is collective. And again, that has been the great contribution of Africa to what Senghor, after Teilhard de Chardin will call the universal civilization. But if Africa has something to contribute, is that really philosophy of being in relation, being to define oneself in terms of that solidarity, and that's really the great concept. Now, how do we transcend our individualities? It is really, I don't know, we've been shaped by egos and so on, and as Mudimbe says, how do you call it, the post-colonial just philosophy of politics. You see what we are seeing, but African values just which have been claimed just even not only by Negritude, but just people like Julius Nyerere, his movement, Nkrumah. I think that will really define us. I don't know, my friend, but just let us try to promote our virtues of being Africans rather than just trying to copy, as Ali Mazrui used to tell us that in one of his papers, lectures, and so us that many of us Africans just we have been shaped by the Western way of thinking, that we eat like just Westerns, we sleep like Westerns, we drink water like Westerns. Or just, that's Ali Mazrui. I don't know, my friend.
One more question. I'm listening to Makoni talk about the breadth of scholarship, and that was certainly apparent in everything you said. And I was wrestling with the phrase epistemic vertigo. I'd like a copy of this paper if it's possible, because I need to broaden my knowledge base. I've read many of the references that you made, but I am not familiar with him as a scholar, so I would like to read more. Is that possible?
Thank you very much, Professor Salik Koko, and just we are working hard just at the forthcoming ASA annual gathering in Atlanta to have a wonderful just session on Mudimbe, and whose papers and many people have been writing to us will really just produce in terms of books, and of course we can really provide what we can. And the only reason that this paper is not just not being made available, because we are talking people so that we can just have just them produce just in the book that will be coming very soon. But yes, we'll help. Yes, thank you. Yes, yes. And that concept of that what is it? Just Mudimbe, what makes his elegance is his in the, just as I said, Aristotelian way, he's a prestigious guy, just intellectually elegant because of his readership. And what he's saying is that just look at, I have read your stuff, I have read your authors. What can you tell me? In fact, I can tell you about your own. Just that's what Mudimbe is, and which means that when you read him, you can be very careful, in the sense that one paragraph from Mudimbe can be charged with just 5 just expressions in Latin or Greek and so on. And can you imagine for somebody who wrote as a philologist or philosopher, he wrote a PhD thesis on the concept of air, A-I-R. What does it mean? And just that's how sophisticated it is. Yes.
Michael Scott wants you to post the benefit of the words in the Lingala song. The song he wanted.
Oh my goodness. I'm a Baptist minister. I don't get into trouble because tomorrow I've got to go to preach in my church. I think people like my big brother, Professor Makoni, they are very acquainted with the song of the 60s. Just African song of independence. Ah, yeah, Africa, oh, liberty. These were the songs of where just Africans were questioning just the post-colonial just philosophy that look at the colonizers are just long gone, but how come that they're still suffering? And I wish Manu Bango was still alive. He could have sung it today in Cameroon, as Paul Biya is just coming back to power again. You see?
Matonde mingi molakisi nangai.
Ah, Olobaka Lingala na sepeli mingi. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Is there anybody who has any other questions? Amazing, continue.
Okay. I don't think anyone has a question now. So I'm going to stop the recording so we can move to the after party, which is not recorded. I'd like to say a very big thank you to Dr. Adrien for making it here with us. And thank you everyone for joining. Our next Mudimbe series will be on August 2nd, and I'll update the house on the speaker and then what we are going to talk about. So thank you everyone. And I'll stop the recording so we move to the after party.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Adrien.
Thank you. Thank you.
We must